Well, hello, Spring Lake Village. Thank you for joining me as we wind down our lecture series on the Greek War of Independence. Well, you might recall in our last lecture, we showed how the revolution nearly collapsed as a result of internal fighting among the Greek rebels. And that would lead to a civil war, which lasted on and off between 1823 and 1826. It was only the arrival of the naval forces led by Ibrahim Pasha of Egypt that brought an end to the civil conflict going on in Greece. Now, this week, we want to focus in on the great powers of Europe, namely Great Britain, France, and the Russian Empire. These three nations would prove pivotal in the eventual victory of the Greeks over the Ottoman Turks. So this week, I want to focus in on the role that the great powers played, beginning in 1826, if not earlier. We'll discuss the treaty that was drafted and the famous Battle of Navarino, which took place in the fall of 1827, largely regarded as one of the most significant naval battles in all of history. So let's begin then. So we have already discussed the all-important siege of Missolonghi, that very strategic port at the entrance of the Gulf of Patras, leading into the all-important Gulf of Corinth, a very strategic city that was overwhelmed by the forces of Ibrahim Pasha and brought then an end to Greek engagement in the western central portion of Greece. This was really in many ways a military turning point, because now the Ottomans could sweep across central Greece and make their way to Athens and the Acropolis, both of which were the last strongholds now in the hands of the Greeks, with the exception of a few fortresses in the Peloponnese or the Morea. So at this point, the commander in charge of the siege of the Acropolis of Athens was Rashid Pasha. And in August of 1826, he began the capture of that all-important fortress. Of course, that's the most famous Acropolis, the high city of the great city-state of Athens. Many of the Greek city-states had these citadels atop a hill, but the Acropolis of Athens was certainly the most significant, and the regime in power normally were headquartered on the Acropolis and often used the existing monuments, in particular the great temple dedicated to Athena, the Parthenon, as the headquarters of the military garrison. Now, you probably recall way back in 1687, 1688, how the Venetians wreaked havoc on the monuments of the Acropolis. The greatest destruction of the Parthenon took place when the Venetians bombed the arsenal, the munitions, the gunpowder that was situated in the Parthenon, and that volley, repeated volley on the Parthenon by the Venetians resulted in widespread destruction. So there were many dilettantes, lovers of Greek antiquities, in particular the British, who did what they could to try to safeguard the monuments, and they were, for the most part, successful, preventing many of the great monuments from suffering further damage during the siege of the Acropolis by the Ottoman Turks. The Greeks fought very bravely to try to prevent the siege of the famous Acropolis. And there was, in addition to Greek troops of about 15,000 irregulars, guerrillas, some 3,000 strong, excuse me, led by this other national hero of Greeks, George Karaskakis, another legendary Greek hero of the revolution. And the Greek troops were led by a French Philhellene, a very capable commander, Charles Nicolas Favier, a member of the Etaria Filiki, and very much supportive of the Greek cause. So in the end, the Greeks were very much outnumbered. They fought very valiantly, and their valor and their bravery would live on even after the siege of the Acropolis. A British commander gave great praise to the Greeks as the little corps Greek forces showed great execution, as did that corps of Philhellenes, again, many of them French, which covered itself with honor by daring bravery. So although the Greeks were unsuccessful in saving the Acropolis from the hands of the Ottoman Turks, they would just 10 months later eventually retake the Acropolis from the Ottomans as one of the last great battles of the Greek War of Revolution. So now come the arrival of the Brits and the other great powers. So England initially had remained somewhat neutral, even though there were many British Philhellenes very much supportive of the war effort, most famous again being Lord Byron. But you gradually see sort of a shift in their neutrality. And this was in no small way motivated by a groundswell of support for the rebellion. And as I mentioned, widespread Philhellenist support of the war. So public opinion would play a leading role. Now in 1822, in September, the British would change the role they would play in the Greek War of Revolution. And this occurred with the appointment of George Canning as the British Foreign Secretary. Again, a devoted Philhellene, very supportive of the Greek cause, one who had great animus against the Ottoman Empire. But in the wake of the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the way Europe had been carved out, especially by Prince Metternich at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, we have now the beginning of what might be called realpolitik. In fact, Metternich is sort of seen as the architect of modern day realpolitik, and that is really, you know, how the great powers should be involved. See them as the great puppeteers trying to commandeer, vying with one another for control of many of the smaller nations of Europe as necessary suzerains of their grand schemes and how they will control different parts of the empire. And the British in particular now were considered the great empire, if not the greatest empire in the world. They had the most formidable navy. The Mediterranean now was their sea. as proven by their brilliant performance during the Napoleonic Wars. So on the one hand, although Canning did not uh, hold the Turks in great regard, he knew that they, as Muslims, had supporters among the great Islamic nations. And in India, as you know, there was a sizable Islamic community. And this, of course, India, this crown colony was the jewel in the crown. And the last thing the British wanted to do was to stir up riots among the Muslim community in India in support of the Ottoman Turks. So he wanted kind of a status quo. He wanted the Ottoman Empire more or less to stay stable and in place, but he was fearful of expansionistic motives in Greece and in the empire on the part of the Russians. And the Russians had long desired to invade different parts of the Ottoman Empire, as we've seen. They saw themselves as the great crusaders and defenders of the Greeks as Orthodox. They needed more than anything else to be able to have access for their vessels by way of the Black Sea, through the Dardanelles Strait, and then onto the Mediterranean. So again, realpolitik. And so the British, as well as the French, were very fearful of Russians involving themselves directly in the Greek conflict without the approval of the French and the British. And they were also, at the same time, the British were fearful of French entanglement because of the alliance that existed between the Russian Empire and France. So we have Britain as well as France, even though it had an alliance, the latter did, with the Russian Empire of expansionist desires of the Russian Empire, especially under Alexander the First. But now I should say Alexander the First kind of wanted to keep the status quo. He wasn't quite as bellicose, but his son then would come to the throne in 1825, Tsar Nicholas the First, and he was much more keen on the ideal of coming to the defense of the Greek rebels in their war against the Ottoman Turks. But again, neither Great Britain nor France wanted unilateral action on the part of the Russian Empire. What the British at this point really sought was supporting and maintaining their lucrative British interests. The British controlled the Ionian Islands, those western string of islands that consisted of Zakynthos, Cephalonia, Lefkada, etc., because this was the only region of Greece, for the most part, not in the hands of the Ottomans, and they had vital business interests. So Canning, for his part now, encouraged the countries of England, I should say France and Russia now, to jointly intervene because he believed this would serve all of their interests. So in July of 1827, they signed what has been called the Treaty of London, which demanded the Ottomans to end their war on Greece and grant the Greeks full autonomy. But the Greeks would still effectively be under the umbrella of the Ottoman Empire, but would be more or less an independent country. So again, the calculus really had changed with the accession to the Russian throne of Tsar Nicholas I. He was relatively young, only 30 years of age, but much more decisive and risk-taking than his deceased brother Alexander I, as well as being much more nationalistic. Regarding foreign policy and the realpolitik taking place in Europe, he more or less adopted a two-faced stance. So in Western Europe, he became notorious as a ferocious defender of the established order that now existed, the balance of power that was negotiated in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. And in fact, he was called the gendarme of Europe by his willingness to dispatch troops as far away as Italy in order to crush liberal revolutions. But in the Balkans, that included Serbia and of course Greece, he eagerly adopted the mantle of the Orthodox crusader and liberator. So this is the type of czar we're dealing with in Russia. So in July of 1827, the great powers, namely Great Britain, France, and Russia, signed the Treaty of London on the 6th of July in 1827. So, citing the disruption of trade in the Mediterranean caused by the Greek War of Independence as justification for Allied intervention, the Treaty of London called for an immediate armistice between the belligerents, in effect demanding a cessation of Ottoman military operations in Greece just when the Ottomans had victory in their grasp. So it also offered Allied mediation in the negotiations on a final settlement that were to follow the armistice. So the treaty itself did not want to take sides, but tacitly, it was in fact proof to the Greek rebels that they now had the support that they had sought after for so long. So as I mentioned, immediate armistice, Greece now would become an independent state, but a suzerain or a dependent of the Ottoman Empire. Now the Greeks readily accepted the treaty, but when the treaty was brought before the Sultan in the Sublime Porte of Constantinople, it was rejected because the Turks truly believed that they would in fact be victorious over the Greeks, as evidenced by the campaigns of Ibrahim Pasha in the Morea and the great victory over the Greeks at Missolonghi and later in Athens. So because the Ottomans rejected the treaty, that gave them now the justification, the moral justification. We now can intervene on behalf of the Greek cause. So this intervention is regarded in history as something of a milestone in modern European history. So it is seen as the first time the European powers, great powers, would intervene on the behalf of a smaller state for humanitarian reasons. Also, this was sort of a global shift in European realpolitik that we see the three greatest powers of Europe, and yes, Russia was considered a European power, united, forming this united front for the first time. So, because they realized mediation between the Greeks and the Turks was untenable, the fact that the Ottomans rejected the Treaty of London, this now was justification for Great Britain, Russia, and France to intervene on behalf of the Greek cause. And they would do so in a big way by providing the necessary equipment and the forces and the training necessary for victory over the Turks on land and on sea. So shortly after, diplomats returned from the Sublime Porte of Constantinople with news that the Sultan had rejected the treaty. Immediately, British Foreign Secretary Canning sent a British Navy under the command of this man, another great Philhellene, a man who had become famous alongside Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar off the coast of Spain in 1804, one of the battles of the so-called Peninsular Wars during the Napoleonic invasions. So Admiral Edward Codrington was sent in order to force the Ottomans to accept an armistice. Now, this individual, although an able commander, a brilliant commander, was a very strong advocate of the Greek cause, one of the most famous of the British Philhellenes. And his directive was only to effect an armistice to help bring about some kind of cessation of hostility, especially in the Moreas. So that was his directive from on high. Now, the British fleet would be eventually joined up by Russian and French warships as they made way to the all-important Bay of Navarino, which was the base of operation for the Turkish fleet and its Egyptian support, its Egyptian fleet as well, that had been sent by Ibrahim Pasha. And it was a very well protected natural harbor. I'll show you in a minute a map of the Bay of Navarino. So Navarino Bay has its own large natural harbor located on the western coast of Messenia in the southwestern Peloponnese, again called Morea at that time. It is more or less about 3 miles in length between the headlands and just a little under 2 miles in width. The bay is sheltered from the open sea by a long, narrow islet. I mentioned the famous island of Sphacteria, site of an earlier engagement. And this islet, as you'll see in the map, leaves 2 entrances to the bay. And because of the sandbank, the northern one is very narrow and shallow, really impossible for large boats, whereas the southern one is considerably larger with an effective passage. So at that time, the Ottoman fleet protected the southern entrance into Navarino Bay. And during the Greek insurgency, the bay was used by the Ottoman Navy as its main operational base in the Peloponnese. And at the time, there was major hostility, war taking place between Ottoman forces and the Greek rebels inland off of Pylos. So that's where the theater of war was taking place off of the Bay of Navarino. So around the 12th of September, the fleet led by Codrington arrived at Navarino, and Codrington sent orders to Ibrahim Pasha to immediately desist in his battle with the Greeks on land. But the Greek army, many had been trained by British soldiers, were scoring some victories against the Ottomans. And they continued to fight, they continued to advance. So this attempt at a truce broke down. And the large presence of the fleet of British, French, and Russian ships should have been a clear warning to Ibrahim Pasha to give it up. But in the end, the battle would be joined because the Turks, realizing the Greeks were continuing to advance, said, no, I'm not going to start fighting. So he upped the ante and committed quite a few atrocities in a number of the small villages inland. Now, Codrington was, as I said, a very able, if not brilliant commander, but his tactical plan was from the outset quite risky because it involved, at the very start, a full engagement of the Ottoman fleet. And remember, the Ottomans earlier on had been trained by French who had been hired. And it would not permit an opportunity to withdraw from the close quarters of within the Bay of Navarino. But he was bold, audacious. He had tremendous faith with the ships and other naval commanders under his command, and he truly believed the British Navy in particular had the technological and tactical upper hand. Again, here's a picture of Edward Codrington, and in the right hand here, a painting of Ibrahim Pasha. So here is Navarino Bay. This is the Island of Sphacteria, the site of many famous historic battles. In Greek history, one took place around 425 during the Peloponnesian War. One of the shields of the Spartans was retrieved, and that shield, I believe it is actually located in the museum at Olympia, but a very important artifact, but again, site of a battle during the Greek War of Independence. But it serves as a western border of Navarino Bay. So two inlets, two straits for passage into Navarino Bay. Again, the northern one, very narrow, very shallow. So the Allied vessels would make their way through the southern entrance. And you can see once inside, you're pretty much stuck. I mean, it's either win the battle or suffer defeat for the most part. So recall that Codrington's instructions from Parliament were to as well as this was the decision on the part of the other great powers as well, were simply to impose and enforce an armistice on both sides and to interdict the flow of reinforcements and supplies from Asia Minor and Egypt to Ottoman forces in Greece. He was only to use force as a last resort. But then on the 20th September, he decided to enter the bay with our fleet, where he was joined up by French and Russian vessels. So, as I mentioned, the Ottomans were incensed, Ibrahim in particular, that while he was expected to observe a ceasefire, Codrington seemingly allowed the Greeks to continue military operations unhindered. So now Navarino Bay had several hundred ships basically staring at one another at point blank range. So Ibrahim Pasha immediately sent a dispatch to Codrington demanding that his fleet exit the bay. Nothing will happen if they simply exit or all hell will be unleashed. But Codrington, quite arrogant in his own right, replied, "You, Ibrahim Pasha, give me, a famed decorated hero, orders to leave and give up? No, I don't take orders, I give them." So immediately, Codrington sailed his flagship, the Warrior, alongside Ibrahim Pasha Egyptian flagship. So initially, really, for Codrington, he believed this was something of a bluff. He believed that Ibrahim Pasha would acquiesce and give it up, and pull anchor and agree to a non-aggression treaty. But that's not what happened. Immediately, the Ottomans shot at a British officer by the name of Fitzroy, as well as some of his crew, as they made their way to the Egyptian flagship in order to give a message. Then the British frigate, the Dartmouth, began to fire upon, as did every other ship in the alliance. The Ottomans sent some of their best fire ships right into the center. So there's a famous painting. There were quite a few paintings done during the Romantic period, chronicling this very historic Battle of Navarino. This, though, gives you a very good idea of the entrance into the Bay of Navarino and the disposition of the ships. But the Ottomans were unable to wreak havoc among the superior Allied vessels, and the British gunnery in particular was able to cause much damage to the Ottoman fleet, and they were beginning to get the upper hand. It was only on the right side, where Russian ships were located, that there was some problems, especially with the Azov. I think I have a picture of it. The Azov, the Russian ship, was sunk, and a couple of other ships suffered some damage after being hit over 150 times. So a little bit about the technical superiority of the British Royal Navy. It had made marked improvements since the Battle of Trafalgar back in 1804. So more than 20 years had lapsed. So ships with triple gun decks, such as Horatio Nelson's famous HMS Victory, had now been phased out. Triple deckers had been found to be too unstable and difficult to maneuver. The Stamford Connecticut class battleship was now a double decker 74-84 gunboat based on the successful 74 French design. So many improvements had been made both to the British and the French Navy vessels in particular. This is another famous painting of the Battle of Navarino Bay. As I mentioned, there are several, but this is one of the more famous by a lesser known English Romantic artist. So the Bay of Navarino would emerge as one of the most famous naval battles in history. It's one of those battles where you imagine if things had gone the other way, Greece might well have become, again, a vassal state permanently of the Ottomans, as well as the entire Balkans. So historians look back and see this as one of the pivotal battles in world history. But by 4 p.m., it was virtually all over for the Turkish Navy. Just 2.5 hours after the engagement had begun, 60 of the 72 or 73 ships of the Turks were sunk, and something in the area between 6,000, maybe even as high as 6,800 Ottomans and Egyptians were dead. For the British and the French and the Russian, about 177 dead, 515 wounded, only a few ships damaged. Of course, the loss of the Azov, as I mentioned, the Russian ship, but couple of the smaller ships were savaged because of some other skirmishes at the end of the battle. Nonetheless, Codrington paid homage to the gallantry of the Turkish fleet in the communiques he sent back to London. He said they fought very, very bravely, but it was a crushing victory. They didn't lose. Again, the Brits didn't lose a single vessel, but the Russians did lose one. As a result, the Ottomans now were unable to control the Morea, and this then would really mark the beginning of the end, which we'll discuss next week. But as I mentioned from the start, Codrington had not been given any orders to really commit the Allied Navy in an all-out naval engagement. His primary directive was to seek an armistice and cessation of hostilities, and yes, some kind of use of force was necessary. But when he returned home, although in the eyes of historians a great tactical victory, many of the high command were very disgruntled because it now would change the calculus of the grand plan of the great powers. Great Britain at this juncture was a little bit not all together in the Greek cause, even though, again, there were many Philhellenes, but they did not want the total crushing of the Ottoman Navy, I should say. They wanted the Ottoman Empire to have some kind of ability to maintain the peace in the Aegean in particular. So Codrington eventually, behind the scenes, although wildly popular among the English people, was eventually demoted. He had only been sent to, as I mentioned, put pressure on the Ottomans. But the famous battle at Navarino goes down in history for two reasons in particular as a great battle. It had been the first time since the late 17th century that both British and French Navy fought together on the same side. And it was the last time in history that a major battle included just sailing ships. So that's one of the reasons for its importance. But again, it changed the geopolitics in the eyes of European leaders, what they deemed a catastrophic victory, because the Sultan back in Constantinople reacted by declaring jihad against the Russian Empire, triggering a whole new theater of war. So this was a dangerous gamble. The British and French were dismayed as they were counting on the Sultan to be a bulwark against growing Russian power. The victory also triggered a later civil war between the Sultan and the Pasha in Egypt, which threatened to rip up the entire Middle East. And as I mentioned, in the corridors of power, Codrington was blamed for precipitating a naval shift in the geopolitical situation. So that is the famous Battle of Navarino, and again studied by naval historians for many, many years. And it is, again, one of the pivotal battles in Western history. I want to show you this watercolor image, a very famous image. There were many of these watercolor images that were rendered by Zoografos Panayotis. He was a famous illustrator and painter, Greek, who chronicled many of the famous battles during the Greek War of Revolution. And this is a very good painting showing you the battle formation of the vessels, with the Allied vessels off to the left and the rebel vessels. Again, and this again is that image showing the Allied vessels entering the Bay of Navarino. Now, I should mention again, before I end, that the British also supplied money in the form of loans to the Greeks, which they had been seeking for some time. And those came in the form of loans, the first one in 1824 and 1825. And these loans would take many years for the Greeks to pay off. Some believe it was sort of the beginning of Britain's firm control, as well as other European powers, of sort of controlling the destiny of the modern state of Greece through their financing packages. Certainly this was also true not long ago with the Greek crisis, the so-called Troika, that affected what many might consider very somewhat onerous terms of repayment. So again, the British loans are sort of the first time of British attempts to sort of have control over the Greeks through financing. So next week, we'll wrap it up with the foundation of the modern Greek states and the legacy of the Greek War of Independence. So look forward to seeing all of you next week, and take care for now.